This December will mark the 200th anniversary of the declaration of the so-called Monroe Doctrine, a U.S. foreign policy position which holds that any intervention in the political affairs of any country in the Western Hemisphere is a potentially hostile act against the United States. It was first articulated by then-President James Monroe on December 2, 1823, during his 7th annual State of the Union address. At that time, nearly all of the Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere had either achieved or were about to achieve independence. Monroe asserted that the New World and the Old World were to remain distinctly separate spheres of influence, and that efforts by European powers to control or influence states in the region would be viewed as a threat to U.S. national security. In return, the U.S., he said, would recognize and not interfere with existing European colonies, nor meddle in the internal affairs of European countries. The Monroe Doctrine has been the bane of the existence of most of the nations in the Western Hemisphere who have suffered Washington's interference in their internal affairs for the past 2 centuries. The pushback, however, has been steady, particularly since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and a variety of other hot spots challenging U.S. domination, including the Sandinista Revolution in 1979 in Nicaragua, and up to and including the development of Bolivarianism in Venezuela and elsewhere. Particularly in the last 20-some-odd years, a growing number of states have exercised their independence from the U.S. That exercise, however, has resembled a tug-of-war from time to time in places like Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Honduras, and elsewhere. One of the weapons that's been used by the U.S. and or its allies on the ground in various countries in the hemisphere has been a process known as lawfare, where the veneer of legality is used to accomplish a soft coup or other impairment of democratic rights and or a democratically elected government. There are even more subtle approaches that have been developed and taken in a variety of places, and today we will discuss several of those, first with Stephen Sefton, speaking with us from Esteli, Nicaragua, and then with Camila Escalante, speaking with us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Stephen, there's an awful lot of really complex stuff here. Why don't you start?
I think you're right, Don. There are very complex processes at work in the region, especially in the context of the developing multipolar world that we're seeing take shape in front of our eyes. We've seen this over the last year or so, and it'll continue to develop, and it's going to be a constant theme in our discussions, I think, in the future.
Yeah, it's a global phenomenon, too, not just regional, but a global phenomenon. That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the regional context, this certainly does present a dilemma to the regional right-wing political forces and the economic interests, the right-wing economic interests of the regional elites in the respective countries in the region, and the events that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, over the last couple of months in particular, in relation to how the right-wing forces in the region are reconfiguring their attempt to keep their grip on power and their control over their respective countries' economies and societies is you can see it happening very, very clearly in different ways. And we've spoken in the past, Don, about the use of lawfare, whereby the right wing will target progressive political leaders to prevent them from coming to power. And it seems to me that now what we're seeing in the region, in countries where there was much political optimism about the change of government, for example, in Colombia with Gustavo Petro, in Mexico with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and in Argentina with the government of Alberto Fernández, perhaps. And there's a lot more to say about the case of Argentina. But in general, people were optimistic that with these progressive leaders, there would be positive change in their respective countries and in the region as a whole. And now what we're seeing is the way the right-wing forces in those countries are mobilizing the levers of, using the levers of power that they have, especially in terms of their control of the judiciary, for example, to impede the free implementation of the very positive economic and social reforms that leaders like Gustavo Petro and Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Alberto Fernández and his vice president Cristina Fernández de Kirchner had were hoping to implement. For example, in Mexico, we've seen over the last week or so that the Supreme Court in Mexico is preventing Andrés Manuel López Obrador from carrying out certain reforms that he was hoping to implement. In Argentina, we've seen the Supreme Court there. Just this week, they issued a judgment rendering inapplicable, according to their judgment, the results in provincial elections. A couple of provincial elections in Argentina, and that has brought them into conflict with the government, a conflict that had already been set in motion by the President Alberto Fernández's objection to the way the Supreme Court had dealt with the case, a case of alleged corruption against his Vice President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner.
Right.
So that's been ongoing there. And in Colombia over the last week or so, we've had a developing, perhaps conflict is to put it too strongly.
Maybe a spat maybe.
Yeah, maybe a spat between the Supreme Court on the side of the public prosecutor, who has criticized Gustavo Petro's handling of the country's internal security situation. Yeah. And that came on top of the fallout from the decision by Gustavo Petro a couple of weeks ago to reshuffle his cabinet, in which he dismissed 5 or 6 ministers from his cabinet who he regarded as holding up his important reforms in terms of land reform, and in particular his projected health reform. So in those 3 countries, you have this pattern of the right wing using their levers of power, especially in relation to their respective countries' judicial systems, not to target individual progressive leaders from actually coming to government. What they're doing now is they're actually targeting the reform programs that these leaders who've now been elected to lead their country's governments, their reform programs are now in jeopardy because the right wing is mobilizing the judiciary to prevent them implementing those reforms.
That's an interesting tactical shift too. In other words, we don't care at some point in time who comes to power because we have constraints on that power so that it can only be exercised in ways that are satisfactory to us. Camila, you've been looking at this development in Chile, right? Maybe you could fill us in with some detail there.
Well, this election that took place on Sunday is an indication of how Chileans feel. It really was a referendum on this new government of Gabriel Boric, who postures himself as some sort of a progressive, left-leaning, but a young face to that. He's very clearly quite anti-socialist, let's say, and very pro-Washington. But they held an election that was to elect the political forces that will be drafting the new Chilean constitution. And the outcome was a major defeat for Gabriel Boric. So on Sunday, Chileans cast their ballots, and what happened was, out of the 51 seats that will be drafting this new constitution, the right and the far right of Chile obtained the majority, and 34 of those 51 seats went to the right wing.
Right.
And this is, the parties of Jose Antonio Cast, who was with the far-right candidate in the previous presidential election,
right,
and a great number of seats to the Pinochetistas, the supporters of the military dictatorship, essentially. And the left only won 16 seats. And so, Borich's people were, are like nowhere to be found in this process. And what this says, I think, is that people are, people in Chile, just like in the rest of Latin America, are done with the pandering to the exterior, the pandering to the United States. They want less of this sort of marketing campaign, marketing Boric as some sort of a champion of democracy and human rights. And what they really want is the actual reforms promised during the campaign period or whatever, in which they said that they would be implementing. They want more actual working to better the conditions of regular people. And that's something that, for example, the government of Lula in Brazil has been really successful in doing. And just to give an example of what Gabriel Boric has been doing during this time, instead of campaigning and trying to, gain, get people who were part of his coalition and those voters who brought him into power with historic numbers, he was busy, trying to meet with Zelensky, talk about the Ukraine issue and the conflict that has nothing to do with Chileans' day-to-day lives. Right. And he was also focused on, for example, attacking Nicaragua's human rights record. And so I think people are really done with this. It really, doesn't matter what party a candidate comes from, but they promise certain things during the campaign. They posture themselves as a certain way, and these people want to see their lives bettered. They don't want to see things getting harder. The cost of living is increasing. And so, this was a huge and very strong message to this government that will now have a very difficult time being reelected.
Well, this is the second draft of the Constitution. The first one had been voted down. This one will be voted on in December, and we'll be watching until then. Thank you, Stephen and Camilla, for your time and expertise, and we will speak again with you next week.
Thanks a million, Don.
Thanks so much, guys.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.